I never imagined that on that peaceful morning, 3 giant bulldozers would brazenly block the entrance to my home in Bozeman, Montana, with Maggie Pierce, the HOA president of Bridger Heights, standing there, smirking as if she held the world in her hands. But she had no idea she'd just crossed the person who owned the very land beneath their feet. Me, Henry Sullivan. And what would you do if you discovered your obnoxious HOA wasn't just harassing you with illegal stunts, but also secretly picking your neighbor's pockets, siphoning off thousands of dollars without anyone knowing? It all started on a warm morning as I knelt in the soft dirt beside my driveway on the outskirts of Bozeman, Montana, planting the last of my bean seedlings. After 15 years as an environmental lawyer working 80-hour weeks, I'd found peace in gardening, the feel of soil between my fingers, the smell of fresh greens keeping me grounded. But then I looked up and saw her, Maggie, standing there, arms crossed over her expensive blouse, dyed blonde hair unruffled by the Montana wind, lips pursed into a thin line of disdain. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice sharp like the chill off the Gallatin Range. I wiped my hands on my apron and stood. "Good morning. Just expanding the veggie garden a bit." Her eyes narrowed, scanning the neat rows of beans along the driveway. Unacceptable. Bridger Heights homes must have approved standard landscaping. Vegetables belong in the back, out of sight. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. She'd turned this friendly neighborhood into a battleground of petty rules and surprise fines over the past 5 years. "My deed predates the HOA by 30 years, I said, noticing how my muddy jeans contrasted with her polished look. "I'm exempt from most of these regulations." She bristled, pulling out her phone. "No such thing. I'm documenting this violation. The board will hear about it." She snapped photos rapidly, fingers flying across the screen. 2 neighbors walking their dogs slowed down, glancing over curiously. "I've read the HOA agreement thoroughly," I said, keeping my tone even. "They acknowledged my exemption once. Want to see the paperwork?" She waved me off. "Save it for the hearing. You'll get a violation notice tomorrow. Clear this veggie mess before you're fined." I stood there, watching her disappear around the Bridger Heights corner, her heels clicking on the Bozeman sidewalk like a warning. The 3 bulldozers still rumbled behind, their exhaust mixing with the fresh earth smell of my bean garden. The curious neighbors dispersed, leaving me with my unfinished planting and a creeping unease. I knew she wasn't kidding. Over 5 years, she'd turned this neighborhood into a prison of absurd rules. I'd seen the old man across the street, fined for a mailbox painted the wrong color, or the family down the road threatened with a lawsuit for leaving bikes out too long. But this time, something felt different, like she was targeting me directly. I went back inside, shed my apron, and washed the mud off my hands. My mind raced with the HOA agreement lines I'd reread since moving here. My family's deed, signed in 1974, clearly stated this lot, along with 4 others, was exempt from any future homeowners association rules. I'd sent a letter to the old board a decade ago, and they'd agreed in writing. So why was she so confident? I climbed the stairs, opened a dusty old filing cabinet, and pulled out the long-forgotten Bridger Heights HOA folder. Sure enough, the exemption confirmation was there, the old chairman's scrawled signature yellowed with age. Before I could reread it, the phone rang. I picked up, and the shaky voice of an elderly woman, a few houses down, came through. "Henry, I saw her hassling you this morning. You're not the first." She was a kind widow, living alone with flower pots on her porch since her husband passed. Last month, they fined the Millers $500 because their wheelchair ramp for their little girl wasn't aesthetically compliant. "I don't think it's right." I frowned, a hot flush running up my spine. "That can't be legal," I said, gripping the receiver. "It's not legal," she whispered, her voice dropping like she feared being overheard. "But the Millers couldn't afford a lawsuit, so they paid and repainted the ramp. She's been pushing harder ever since that board lawyer showed up." I thanked her and hung up, my mind spinning. $500 for a wheelchair ramp? That's not neighborhood management, it's extortion. I looked out the window, the late afternoon sun casting a red glow over the distant Gallatin Range. If she'd done that to the Millers, my bean garden was just an excuse. Something bigger was brewing in Bridger Heights, and I needed to figure it out before those bulldozers came back. I sat at the kitchen table, the dim yellow light spilling over the open Bridger Heights HOA folder in front of me. Outside, the Montana night wind whistled through, carrying the faint howl from the far-off Gallatin Range. I flipped through the old pages, the smell of faded ink and yellowed paper, stirring memories of my dad sitting here, talking about the land the Sullivans once owned. "We didn't just sell land, Henry," he'd said, his voice deep with pride. "We kept what mattered most." I hadn't paid much attention then, just a kid more interested in kicking a ball across Bozeman's fields, but now I needed to understand what he meant. The exemption letter from the old board sat on the first page, dated clearly, March 15, 1995. The chairman had written succinctly, "The Sullivan lot in Bridger Heights is exempt from HOA regulations per the 1974 land sale contract." I nodded, slightly reassured, but the widow's words echoed, "She's been pushing harder." If the old board respected my rights, why did she dare bring bulldozers? I flipped further, searching for something concrete to shatter her confidence. Then I found it, a thicker packet, stapled with a rusty clip, labeled in my dad's shaky handwriting, "Land Sale Contract, 1974. I opened it, heart pounding as I read each line. The Sullivans had sold over 200 acres in Gallatin County to the Bridger Heights Development Company, but not everything. My dad, with the foresight of a man who'd lived through 2 recessions, kept 3 things: mineral rights under the entire area, rights to the main utility easements, and permanent exemption from any homeowners association for 5 family lots, including the house I sat in. I muttered, "Smart old man, this wasn't just an exemption, it was control over a chunk of Bozeman she didn't even know about." I stood, stepped onto the back porch, and looked down at Bridger Heights settling into darkness. The paved streets, the glowing streetlights, all sat on utility easements my family still legally owned. If she touched my bean garden, she wasn't just breaching an exemption, she was trespassing on private property. But what about the mineral rights? I vaguely recalled Dad mentioning limestone or something under this land, but I'd thought he was joking back then. I returned to the table, pulling another box of old files from under the cabinet, stuff I hadn't touched since Mom died 10 years ago. Just then, I heard the low rumble of heavy engines in the distance. I ran to the front window, heart racing. The 3 bulldozers were back, rolling slowly down the street, stopping right at my driveway. There she was, a small but commanding figure under the streetlights, next to a tall guy in an expensive suit. Neighbors started peeking out their doors. A few kids stopped biking to watch. I stood frozen at the window, my breath fogging the glass as Bozeman's streetlights glinted off the 3 massive bulldozers. The engines roared, shaking the floor, drowning out the peaceful Montana night wind. I clutched the 1974 contract, the crumpled old pages like a flimsy shield against what was coming. She stepped from the shadows, pristine in a white coat, blonde hair untouched by the cold gusts off the Gallatin Range. Beside her was the tall guy in a glossy suit, holding a stack of papers, his face blank as a robot's. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, some in hastily thrown-on jackets, kids whispering and pointing. I took a deep breath, stepped onto the front porch, determined not to let her see me shake. "Henry Sullivan," she called out, her voice cutting through the bulldozer noise, loud enough for all of Bridger Heights to hear. "The board held an emergency meeting last night. Your violation is severe enough to warrant immediate action." The suit stepped forward, raising a hand like he was passing judgment. "I'm the Bridger Heights HOA attorney. These bean rows," he pointed at my garden, "are an unpermitted structure, a public nuisance under Rule 8.3. They'll be removed now." I heard murmurs from the crowd. The old lady across the street covered her mouth. The kids stopped biking, eyes wide. I stepped off the porch, forcing my voice to stay steady. "You should check the law before you act," I said, locking eyes with the attorney. "Those aren't structures, just temporary rows. More importantly, you're standing on land I own. A very costly mistake." The attorney's lip twitched, but his smirk faltered. She stepped up, practically glowing with confidence. "Henry, don't be stubborn. Agree to remove this ugly mess, pay the $300 in accrued fines, and it's over." The bulldozers revved louder, one driver shifting in the cab, glancing at me like he awaited orders. I pulled out my phone, hitting record. Before you move forward, I'm recording this. I also just texted my old firm's assistant to come. Oh, and there's one more thing about this land you should know. Her eyes widened, then she waved me off like swatting a fly. Don't play lawyer with me, Henry. Nothing's stopping this. Just then, a car horn blared. The crowd parted as a Gallatin County Sheriff's vehicle rolled up, lights flashing red and blue. A woman stepped out, arms full of oversized maps, followed by the sheriff I recognized from town meetings. Her face flickered with confusion, then hardened. "What's this?" she snapped. "We don't need cops for HOA business." I smiled for the first time that day. You don't realize whose driveway you just blocked, or whose land those bulldozers are parked on. The woman laid the maps across the patrol car's hood, spreading them under the light. The crowd edged closer, whispering. "This is the original 1973 survey," she said, pointing to faded lines. "And this is the contract between the Sullivan family and Bridger Heights Development." The sheriff cleared his throat. I'd listen close to what's about to be explained. I stepped forward, still clutching the 1974 contract. "When my family sold this land, we kept mineral rights under 200 acres, utility rights under the roads, and exemption from the HOA for 5 lots, including my house." The attorney flipped through his papers, his face paling. She flushed red, her voice sharp. "Whatever privileges your house has, you still can't violate community rules." The sheriff cut in. Under Gallatin County law, he can do what he wants on his land as long as it's not zoning restricted. Beans are perfectly legal. The crowd stirred, a few nodding. I looked straight at her. "Want to tear up my garden? Go ahead, but it'll cost you dearly." Standing on the porch, I watched the 3 bulldozers back away from my driveway, their engines fading into the Bozeman night. The crowd of neighbors dispersed, some glancing back, whispering to each other. The sheriff nodded at me before getting in his car, leaving the county worker with her stack of maps to pack up. She and the attorney had retreated, their faces stiff as if they'd swallowed something bitter. A small sense of victory crept in, but the fury in her eyes before she left kept me from relaxing. This wasn't over. I knew that much. I went back inside, set the papers on the kitchen table, and grabbed my phone to text the old lady a few houses down. She just brought bulldozers, but I got them to leave. "You were right. Something's off." As soon as the message sent, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find her standing there, leaning on her cane, eyes sharp despite her wrinkled face. "Henry, I need to talk to you now," she whispered, glancing around like she feared being overheard. I invited her in, pouring a cup of warm tea, the only thing I could find in my messy kitchen after a long day. She sat down, placing a thin stack of papers on the table, crumpled like they'd been pulled from the bottom of a drawer. "My husband was an accountant for 50 years before he passed," she began, her voice trembling. "He suspected something about the Bridger Heights board but never got to act on it. Last month I dug through old papers after they fined me $200 for hanging Christmas lights 2 days too long." I frowned, setting my tea down. "Fined for Christmas lights?" She nodded, pushing the papers toward me. "These are HOA financial reports from the last few years. I'm not as good at reading them as he was, but I know the fine money isn't going anywhere." I flipped through the pages, eyes locked on the numbers. Dozens of fines, $50 for tall grass, $100 for a misplaced trash can, $500 for the Miller's wheelchair ramp. But the community fund didn't grow. A pool renovation fee of $300 per house was collected last year, totaling over $30,000, yet the Bridger Heights pool still sat covered in moss, untouched. "Where's this money going?" I muttered, my finger tracing the columns. She shrugged. "I don't know, but she and that attorney are definitely involved." I stood, pacing the kitchen, my mind racing. If she was bold enough to embezzle fine money, targeting my bean garden wasn't just personal. It might tie to the land rights I'd just uncovered. I needed someone to dig deeper. I thought of a guy I knew, a reporter at the Bozeman Daily Chronicle I'd met during an environmental case a few years back. I picked up the phone and dialed. "Tom, it's Henry Sullivan. I need you to look into something at Bridger Heights. It might be bigger than you think." He answered right away, voice curious. "Henry, I heard bulldozers showed up at your place tonight. What's going on?" I glanced at the old lady, then down at the papers. "The HOA's stealing from my neighbors, and I've got proof. But I think it goes beyond that. Can you check what she and that attorney are hiding?" Tom chuckled over the line. "I love stories like this. Send me the evidence, and I'll start now." I hung up, looking at her. If Tom finds more, we could take her down. She gave a faint smile, gripping her cane. "Be careful, Henry. She's not alone. I've heard that attorney has ties to some real estate developers in Gallatin County." I nodded, a chill running down my spine. The mineral rights under Bridger Heights flashed in my mind. If they wanted that, my bean garden was just an excuse. I sat in the kitchen, the dim light casting shadows over the old lady's papers, and the 1974 contract beside them. The Bozeman night had deepened, the cold wind from the Gallatin Range whistling through the door cracks, but my mind wouldn't stop spinning. The numbers in the HOA financials danced before my eyes, over $30,000 for a pool no one fixed, thousands in fines vanishing without a trace. The old lady had gone home after warning me about the attorney's ties to Gallatin County real estate players. If she was embezzling money, the mineral rights under Bridger Heights my family held might be what she was really after. I needed more proof, and I needed it fast. My phone buzzed. Tom's number. "Henry, I've looked at the docs you sent." His voice rushed through the speaker. "There are some shady transfers from the HOA fund to a company called Gallatin Ventures. I'm digging deeper, but you should know, this company's linked to a big real estate developer in Montana." I frowned, setting my pen down.
"Who?"
Tom lowered his voice. "Victor Grayson. He's a shark for land with mineral value. If your property's got limestone or something, she's not just after your garden." I took a deep breath, a chill running down my spine. "Thanks, Tom. Let me know the second you find more." I hung up, staring at the 1974 contract, the mineral rights line jumping out at me. Dad wasn't kidding when he kept this, but I needed to be sure. I thought of my cousin in Helena, who'd held onto some family papers after Mom passed. I dialed her number, and her voice came through after 2 rings. "Henry, calling this late means something big, huh?" I gave a small laugh, trying to sound calm. "You're right. Do you still have Grandpa's old papers? About the Bozeman land?" She paused. "Yeah, in the storage shed. I'll check and fax them to you tomorrow morning." "What's so urgent?" I gave her a quick rundown. Bulldozers, her and my suspicions about the land rights. She whistled. "Grandpa always said that land was worth more than people thought. Hang tight." The next morning, the fax machine whirred in the living room corner. I rushed over, pulling out sheets, a copy of the 1974 contract, plus a handwritten note from Grandpa. "Limestone under Bridger Heights, significant reserves, untapped." My heart pounded. If Victor Grayson knew this, my bean garden was just a pretext to pressure me into giving up the land. I called Tom back. "I just got more papers. My land's got limestone, and I think they want it." Tom growled over the phone. "Bingo. I just found out Gallatin Ventures is registered under the HOA attorney's name, but Victor's the main shareholder. They've bought extraction rights from her, illegally, since you're the real owner." I shot up, stepped onto the front porch, and looked down at the quiet Bridger Heights under Montana's early sun. The roads, the streetlights, all sat on easements I owned. If they wanted the limestone, they'd need control of this whole area, and she was the perfect puppet to force people to sell cheap. I went back in, flipping through the old lady's financials again. A small line at the bottom stopped me cold. Geological survey fee, $5,000, paid to Gallatin Ventures. They'd known about the limestone all along, and she'd used HOA money to plan it. The phone rang again. "Tom." "Henry, big news. I hacked the attorney's internal emails. They're planning to use HOA rules to seize your family's 5 exempt lots, then sell them to Victor for double. Your garden's the first target." I gripped the phone, heat rushing to my head. "They have no right. My paperwork's clear." Tom chuckled. "They know, but figured you'd cave under pressure. What's your next move?" I looked out at the bean garden, a few plants tilted from the night wind. I'll show them they're dead wrong. Send me that email, Tom. And get your pen ready. This is hitting the news. I hung up, feeling like I'd stepped into a chess game bigger than I'd imagined. She didn't just want my garden, she wanted all of Gallatin County under my feet. From the porch, I gazed at the bean garden under Bozeman's faint moonlight, a few plants bent by the night wind, like a bad omen. After Tom's call, I couldn't sleep. My mind churned with the attorney's internal email, their plan to seize my family's land, and Victor Grayson's name. The mineral rights under Bridger Heights weren't a secret anymore, and she knew I'd caught on to their game. My phone buzzed, a text from Tom. Email sent. Story goes live tomorrow morning. Stay safe, Henry. I opened my laptop, reading the cold lines in the email. Sullivan Lot is top priority. Force him off the garden, then use HOA rules to take the land. I clenched my fists, heat surging to my head. A strange sound snapped me out of it, sharp glass shattering from the garden. I bolted to the door, heart racing. Under the streetlights, two figures in black hoodies were yanking up my bean rows, white roots torn from the soil and flung across the yard. I recognized her dyed blonde hair instantly. Even under the hood, no one in Bridger Heights had that arrogant stride. Beside her was the tall guy, definitely her attorney. I shouted, "Stop right now," but she turned, eyes flashing in the dark, then slashed her hand across her throat, before they both jumped into a car and sped off. I ran down to the yard, mud sticking to my shoes, trying to save what beans were left. The fresh earth smell mixed with acrid car oil choked me. A crumpled paper lay amid the mess, scrawled words, "Give up, Henry, or this is just the start." I picked it up, hands shaking, then snapped a photo and sent it to Tom. "They just trashed my garden. Can you run the story earlier?" He replied instantly. "Yes, 6 a.m. today, all of Bozeman will know." I went back inside and called Gallatin County Police. While waiting, I checked the security camera, blurry footage, but it clearly caught her and the attorney, faces lit under the streetlight as her hood slipped. The cop arrived 20 minutes later, surveyed the scene, and shook his head at the video. "Clear property damage, but we need more to arrest them now." I handed him the note. "Is this enough?" He nodded. "I'll report it up. Stay safe, Henry." They seemed desperate. The next morning I woke to the phone blaring. Tom yelled through the speaker, "Stories live, Bridger Heights HOA corruption, thousands missing, land targeted, neighbors are calling me, they're pissed." I opened my laptop, seeing the Bozeman Daily Chronicle headline with a photo of my wrecked garden from last night. Comments flooded in. "I got fined $100 for my trash can. She threatened to sue me over chickens." I smiled, but only for a second. I had to seize this moment. I called the old lady. "Can you come over? I want to meet with a few people before she strikes back." She agreed instantly. An hour later, my kitchen was packed. The old lady with her cane, the gray-haired man across the street, fined for his mailbox, and the young woman from down the road threatened over bikes. I set the laptop on the table, opening Tom's article. "They're not just after me," I said, pointing to the printed email. "They want our land to sell to Victor Grayson for limestone." The old man slammed the table. "I know that guy. He tried buying my place dirt cheap 5 years ago." The young woman nodded. "They find me constantly, probably to force me to sell." The old lady put a hand on my shoulder. "She won't stop, Henry. Trashing your garden is just the start." I nodded, glancing out the window, the wrecked garden now a challenge. "Then we won't stop either. I've got land rights proof, Tom's got the press, and we've got each other. Next time she comes, she'll face all of Bridger Heights behind me." The group nodded, eyes lighting up. I stood in the kitchen, watching the small group gathered around the table, the stale coffee smell mixing with the tense morning air of Bozeman. The trashed bean garden outside, under faint sunlight from the Gallatin Range, was a stark reminder of her strike last night. The old lady sat beside me, cane in hand, eyes sharp though her voice wavered. The gray-haired man across the street tapped the table, face reddening as he recounted his mailbox fine. The young woman from down the road, hair tied high, clutched her coffee mug, eyes blazing as she recalled the bike threats. Tom's article on the laptop stayed open. The headline: Bridger Heights HOA corruption, like a smoldering fire, ready to flare. I didn't think they'd dare trash your garden like that, the old man said, voice dropping. But looking back, I got fined $75 for painting my mailbox gray instead of standard dark gray. I thought it was just dumb rules. Now I see they're choking us bit by bit. The young woman nodded, setting her mug down hard enough to slosh coffee. They fined me $50 every time I left my bike out. 3 times in 1 month. I had to work extra shifts at the diner to pay. Now you say they want our land. I believe it. The old lady cleared her throat, pointing at the attorney's email. They're targeting your 5 exempt lots, Henry, but who's to say they'll stop there? If Victor Grayson wants limestone, all of Bridger Heights could be next. I nodded, pushing the stack of 1974 contracts to the center of the table. My family kept mineral rights under 200 acres of this land and exemption from the HOA for 5 lots, including my house. She trashed my garden to pressure me into giving up, then planned to use HOA rules to seize it legally. But thanks to Tom, we have proof they're embezzling money, and thanks to you we know where it's going. I pointed to the financial report, the geological survey fee line, $5,000 paid to Gallatin Ventures. They've been planning to mine it for a while, and she's the perfect pawn. The old man slammed his hand on the table. I remember Victor. He came to my house 5 years ago, offered a dirt cheap price to buy my land, talking about community development. I refused, and right after, the HOA started fining me non-stop. The young woman gritted her teeth. If they get your land, Henry, my house next door won't stand a chance. I'm not selling, it's my mom's house. I looked around, seeing their eyes shift from fear to resolve. We won't let them win, I said. But I need you all behind me. The official HOA meeting's next week. That's our chance to fight back. The old lady smiled, gripping her cane tightly. I'll bring all my husband's old papers, stuff he kept about the HOA. There might be something useful. The old man nodded. I'll call some old buddies in the neighborhood. They've been fined for all sorts of things. They'll join. The young woman smirked. I've got friends at the diner who live around here. I'll get them to come to the meeting. She won't see it coming. I nodded, feeling a spark ignite in the darkness of Bridger Heights. I'll get Tom to run another story before the meeting. Stir things up more. She wants to play dirty? We'll play big. My phone buzzed, a text from Tom. Neighbors have been calling all morning, wanting to meet me. They're in. Got a plan yet? I replied fast. Meeting at my place tonight. Bring more people. I looked at the group. Tonight we meet with a bigger crowd. Anyone she's harassed, I want to hear it all. We'll make a list, gather evidence, and bring it to the HOA meeting. All 3 nodded, standing with a determination I'd never seen in them before. That night my house was packed, over 20 people crammed from the kitchen to the living room. Voices buzzed, from an old guy recounting a fine for keeping a dog to a young mom complaining about a surprise bus fee. I stood in the middle, holding up the 1974 contract. They think we're weak, but they're wrong. We have the truth, and we have each other. The crowd clapped, a few shouting agreement. The old lady whispered to me, She won't expect this, Henry. I nodded, glancing out the window, the wrecked garden now a symbol of the fight. In front of the bedroom mirror, I adjusted my tie, something I hadn't touched since quitting law 3 years ago. Bozeman's faint morning light slipped through the curtains, illuminating the 1974 contract and the stack of papers I'd prepped all night. After last night's meeting, over 20 neighbors were on board, with a complaint list about her spanning 2 pages from trash can fines to threats over raising chickens. Tom's second article went live this morning. Bold headline, Bridger Heights residents rebel. HOA faces corruption charges. My phone buzzed non-stop with supportive texts, but I knew she wouldn't sit still. The HOA meeting next week was the big chance, but first, I had to face her opening move. The doorbell rang. I opened it to find the cop from the other night, holding an envelope. Henry, this is a summons from Bridger Heights HOA. They're suing you for environmental violations with that bean garden. I smirked, taking the paper. That was fast, thanks. I tore it open, skimming. They claimed my garden caused soil contamination and neighborhood aesthetic harm, demanding a $1,000 fine and immediate removal. I snorted. This was retaliation for the garden trashing, but also her mistake. I texted Tom, "They're suing me. Gallatin County Court, tomorrow. Post it now." He replied, "Done. All of Bozeman will know." The next day, I stepped into the Gallatin County courtroom, the chilly air laced with the smell of old wood and paper. Over 30 neighbors filled the seats behind me. The old lady with her cane, the gray-haired man, the young woman from the diner, even faces I didn't recognize. She sat at the plaintiff's table in a crisp white suit, blonde hair gleaming under the lights. The attorney stood beside her, clutching a briefcase, face calm like he hadn't trashed my garden that night. The judge, an older man with thick glasses, banged the gavel. Case of Bridger Heights HOA versus Henry Sullivan. Plaintiff, proceed. The attorney rose, voice smooth as oil. Your Honor, Mr. Sullivan constructed an illegal agricultural structure in a zoned residential area, violating Montana environmental law and HOA rules. We request immediate removal and a $1,000 fine to offset aesthetic damage. He submitted photos, my bean garden pre-trashing, angled to look messier than it was. The crowd behind murmured, some shaking their heads. She smirked, eyes flicking to me like she'd already won. The judge looked at me. Defendant, your response? I stood, taking a deep breath. The old lawyer instincts flooding back. Your Honor, this isn't an environmental case. It's personal retaliation. I'm representing myself, and I have evidence. I set the 1974 contract on the table, voice steady but firm. My family sold land to Bridger Heights in 1974, but retained exemption from all HOA rules for 5 lots, including mine. This is a notarized copy, verified by Gallatin County. I added the 1995 letter from the old board. They recognized this exemption. My bean garden violates nothing. The attorney jumped up. That's outdated nonsense. HOA rules apply to every home in Bridger Heights, no exceptions. I turned to him, keeping my tone even. Wrong. This contract was recorded before the HOA existed, and under Montana law, it supersedes any later rules. Plus, this isn't a structure's just temporary rows, legal under Gallatin County zoning. I placed security camera photos on the table. Here's proof they vandalized my garden the night before, after I refused to remove it. That's the real violation. The crowd erupted, a few yelling, "That's right." The judge banged the gavel, calling for order. She shot up, face beat red. Those accusations are baseless. We acted for the community's good. I locked eyes with her. Community good or Gallatin Ventures good. I have internal emails proving you and him embezzled HOA funds, targeting my land for a guy named Victor Grayson. The attorney paled, flipping through his papers but saying nothing. The judge leaned down to review the 1974 contract, then looked up. I need time to examine this, but based on these documents, I'm issuing a temporary injunction barring HOA action against Mr. Sullivan until a final ruling. Court adjourned. He banged the gavel, the sound echoing through the room. The crowd cheered, the old lady raising her cane in triumph. She stormed out, the attorney scrambling after, face dark. I turned back, seeing neighbors smiling at me. For the first time they weren't just strangers in Bridger Heights. I stepped out of the Gallatin County Courthouse, Montana sunlight hitting the beaming faces of over 30 neighbors waiting in the yard. The old lady raised her cane with a grin, the gray-haired man slapped my shoulder, and the diner girl shouted, "We won, Henry." I smiled, but inside I knew it was just a small victory. Tom stood nearby, phone pressed to his ear, nodding furiously. "The new story's spreading across Bozeman," he said, eyes gleaming. "All of Montana's talking about the lawsuit. She and that attorney must be fuming." I nodded, gazing at the distant Gallatin range. "Good, but the HOA meeting next week decides everything. They won't give up." That night, I sat in the living room, the 1974 contract and the attorney's emails spread across the table. Cold wind from Bridger Heights whistled through the window, carrying the damp earth smell from the trashed garden. My phone buzzed, a call from my cousin in Helena. "Henry, guess what I just found?" Her voice urgent. Grandpa's handwritten journal, in the old paper box. "I'm driving to Bozeman now." I sat up straight. "A journal? About the land?" She chuckled. "Exactly. You'll want to read it." 3 hours later, she walked in, hair wind-tossed, clutching a worn brown leather notebook. I poured coffee, and we sat at the table. She opened it, pointing to a page in faded black ink. "September 12, 1973, she read aloud. "Geological survey confirmed large limestone reserves under Bridger Heights land. I kept the mineral rights. No developers will steal it." I muttered. Grandpa knew its worth. She nodded. He wrote more. "If they want the limestone, they'll have to go through me. See, Henry, this is why they're after you." I snapped a photo of the page, sending it to Tom. "This is the missing piece. Can you check if Victor Grayson's tied to limestone?" Tom called back 20 minutes later, voice taut. "Henry, you hit the jackpot. I dug up a contract from Gallatin Ventures. They bought limestone extraction rights under Bridger Heights from the HOA 6 months ago for $500,000. But it's signed by the attorney, and the money went straight to her personal account. That deal's illegal. You're the true owner." I clenched my fist. They knew I had the mineral rights, so they tried forcing me off the land before I figured it out. I stood, stepping onto the back porch, looking down at the quiet neighborhood. Streetlights glowed on easements I owned, houses sitting on land Grandpa had protected. If Victor got the limestone, Bridger Heights would become a mining pit, neighbors homeless, Bozeman losing a piece of its soul. I went back in, texting Tom, "Post it now. Expose that contract." He replied, "Tomorrow morning all of Montana will see. What's your next move?" I typed fast, "Sue them back. They trespassed on my property." The next morning, I called my old lawyer from the Helena firm, the guy who'd helped me win my biggest environmental case. "Mark, I need you to file a lawsuit against Bridger Heights HOA and Gallatin Ventures. They illegally bought extraction rights to my land." He laughed over the phone. "Sounds like your kind of case, Henry. Send me the docs, I'll draft it now." I faxed the 1974 contract, Grandpa's journal, and the attorney's emails. Mark called back 2 hours later. "Lawsuit's ready. I'm filing it with Montana State Court this afternoon. Charges of property trespass, fraud and HOA abuse. If we win, you could get major damages." My phone buzzed again. "Tom. Stories live. Bridger Heights HOA illegally sold land to developer. Neighbors are rallying outside her house with protest signs." I ran to the window, spotting familiar faces from last night's meeting, the old man with a "Give us our money back" sign, the diner girl shouting through a megaphone. I texted the old lady. "They're protesting. Can you come?" She replied, "On my way, bringing more old papers." Watching the crowd of neighbors waving signs outside her house in the distance at Bridger Heights, the Montana wind blew harder, carrying a biting chill from the Gallatin Range. But inside I burned hot. Tom's latest story was sweeping Bozeman, Gallatin Ventures' illegal contract exposed, and my countersuit filed with the state court. My phone buzzed non-stop, texts from neighbors, Tom, even strangers from Helena who'd read the news. "We're behind you, Henry," one wrote. I smiled, but unease crept in. She and Victor were cornered, and desperate people are the most dangerous. That night, I sat in the living room, organizing papers, the 1974 contract, Grandpa's journal, the attorney's emails, prepping for tomorrow's HOA meeting. The clock ticked alongside the wind howling outside, offering a rare calm after chaotic days. I texted the old lady, "Tomorrow's the final round. Bring your papers." She replied, "I'll be there, Henry. Watch out tonight. I don't trust her." I chuckled, texting back, "Doors locked. Good night." But as I set the phone down, I heard glass shatter downstairs. I bolted up, heart pounding, racing to the stairs. The sharp smell of gasoline hit me, followed by flickering orange light from the kitchen. I rushed down, seeing the window smashed, a burning glass bottle rolling on the floor, flames licking the curtains. "Damn it," I yelled, lunging for the extinguisher under the sink, but black smoke thickened, choking me. My phone rang. The old lady. I answered, voice raspy. My house is on fire. Call the police. She shouted through the speaker. I saw them run from your place, her and the attorney. I'm calling now. I sprayed the extinguisher, but the fire spread too fast, swallowing the kitchen corner where I'd left the papers. I ran to the table, grabbed the 1974 contract and Grandpa's journal, and stuffed them into my jacket. Smoke stung my eyes, flames roaring toward the stairs. I bolted out the front door just as a small explosion sounded, the gas can in the kitchen igniting. I stumbled into the yard, coughing hard, watching the fire devour the Sullivan family's ancestral home. Police sirens wailed in the distance, red and blue lights flashing through the Bozeman night. Neighbors rushed over, the gray-haired man shouting, the diner girl sprinting with a bucket of water from her house. "Henry, you okay?" she yelled. I nodded, clutching the papers in my coat. Police and firefighters arrived 10 minutes later, putting out the blaze, but the kitchen and living room were ash. The sheriff from the bulldozer incident approached, face grim. Who did this? I pointed toward Bridger Heights. Her and the attorney. The old lady saw them run. She hobbled up, leaning on her cane, panting. Couldn't sleep. Looked out my window and saw two figures throw a gas bottle through yours. Her blonde hair's unmistakable. The sheriff nodded, barking into his radio. Pick them up now. Arson and vandalism charges. Neighbors gathered around me, some draping blankets over my shoulders, others hauling water to douse embers. The old man muttered, "They're crazy, Henry. Burning your house won't silence us." The diner girl grabbed my hand. "We'll fix the garden, fix the house. They won't win." I nodded, a mix of loss and fury swirling inside. The home my parents left me was half gone, but the papers in my grip, contract and journal, were intact. My last weapon. The sheriff returned. Caught them 2 miles out, car reeking of gas. They're claiming accident, but with your camera and a witness, they're done. I smirked. Good. Add property destruction and life endangerment to my lawsuit. He nodded. Will do, but watch out, Henry. Victor Grayson's still out there. I looked at the ashes, then at the neighbors. They wanted to destroy evidence, but I saved this, I said, holding up the contract. The crowd cheered, some clapping. Tom rushed up, camera in hand. I got it all. This hits the news tomorrow. Montana will see how desperate she is. I nodded, voice hoarse. Run it, Tom. And tell everyone the HOA meeting tomorrow's still on. I'm ending this. The old lady touched my shoulder. You're not alone, Henry. We'll stand there with you. I stood before the smoldering ruins of my family's home, Bozeman's early sun lighting the charred wood and wrecked bean garden. Last night, after the fire, neighbors stayed late, bringing blankets and water, helping clear what remained. The old lady sat with me on the porch, gripping her cane, whispering, "They can't break your spirit, Henry." I nodded, still holding the 1974 contract and Grandpa's journal, the only things I'd saved from the flames. She and the attorney were in custody, but Victor Grayson was still out there, and my countersuit in Montana State Court today would be the final blow. Tom arrived early, camera ready. Stories live. Bridger Heights HOA chair burns resident's home after land scandal. Hundreds reading it, Henry. Montana's watching you. I smirked. Good. Film everything today. I want people to see the end. The gray-haired man and diner girl approached, carrying protest signs from before. We're with you, the old man said. They burned your house, they burned our trust. I nodded, warmth creeping through the wreckage. Let's go. Today we take it all back. The Montana State courtroom in Helena was packed. Over 50 Bridger Heights neighbors filled the seats, some holding justice for Bozeman signs. I stood at the defendant's table with my old lawyer, Mark, who'd flown in from Helena this morning. She and the attorney sat at the plaintiff's side, wrists cuffed, faces pale under fluorescent lights. Victor Grayson was absent, Tom whispered. He's hiding, but cops are after him. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a sharp voice, banged the gavel. Case of Henry Sullivan versus Bridger Heights HOA and Gallatin Ventures. Defendant, proceed. Mark stood, voice low but resonant. Your Honor, we're suing Bridger Heights HOA and Gallatin Ventures for property trespass, fraud, and abuse of power. The Sullivan family owns mineral rights under 200 acres of Bridger Heights per this 1974 contract. He held up the notarized copy. They illegally sold extraction rights to Victor Grayson without Mr. Sullivan's consent, while embezzling HOA funds to plan it. I added Grandpa's journal, voice firm. My grandfather wrote it clear. The limestone here is ours. They knew, so they trashed my garden and burned my house to destroy evidence. The crowd murmured, some filming on phones. The attorney leapt up, voice shaky. We didn't know about mineral rights. The Gallatin Ventures deal was legal. Sullivan's making this up to dodge fines. Mark smirked, setting the internal email on the table. This proves they targeted Sullivan's land from the start, using HOA rules to force him out. And this, he held up camera stills, is them burning his house last night. This isn't a dispute, it's a crime. She screamed, face crimson. It's all lies. We protected the community, not stole. The judge banged the gavel. Quiet. I've reviewed the evidence, 1974 contract, journal, emails, and HOA financials. She looked at me. Mr. Sullivan, your demands? I stepped forward. I want Gallatin Ventures extraction deal voided, them prosecuted for fraud and vandalism, and compensation for my house damage to rebuild for all of Bridger Heights. The judge studied the papers, then spoke after 10 tense minutes. Based on evidence, the 1974 contract holds superior legal weight. Mineral rights belong to Mr. Sullivan. Gallatin Ventures deal with the HOA is illegal. I declare it void. Bridger Heights HOA and defendants must pay Mr. Sullivan $500,000 for property damage and fraud. The vandalism case moves to criminal court. She banged the gavel, the sound echoing. The crowd roared. The old man raising a justice sign. The diner girl hugged me. The old lady grinned toothlessly. She slumped in her seat. The attorney bowed his head, cuffs clanking as police led them out. Mark slapped my shoulder. Big win, Henry. $500,000 rebuilds your house and more. I nodded, looking at the neighbors. This money's not just mine, it's for all of us. Outside the courthouse, Tom turned on the camera. Henry, say something to Bozeman. I took a deep breath, facing the lens. They tried stealing the land beneath us, but we stood up. This is Bridger Heights' win, Montana's win. Victor can run, but not forever. The crowd cheered, some yelling, Henry. I turned to the old lady. HOA meeting tonight. You ready? She raised her cane. Been ready for ages. I stood before my home's ashes, Bozeman's sunset gilding the charred wood and barren bean garden. This morning's state court victory echoed in my mind. Victor's extraction deal voided, her and the attorney facing criminal charges, and $500,000 compensation in my hands. But staring at the ancestral ruin, I didn't feel full joy. Neighbors gathered post-trial, hugging my shoulders, clapping, but I knew this wasn't just my win, it was Bridger Heights. That night, the HOA meeting happened at the neighborhood community center, a few blocks from my place. Over 70 people crammed the small room, chairs scarce, some leaning on walls, others sitting on the floor. The old lady sat front row, cane in hand, beside the gray-haired man and diner girl. Tom stood in the corner, camera rolling. I stepped to the podium, holding the 1974 contract and a crackling old mic. They wanted to steal the ground beneath us, I said, voice booming through the speaker. But today's state court confirmed the mineral rights are my family's, and I'm using them to protect us all. The crowd clapped, some cheering. The old man raised his hand. What about the HOA now, Henry? We don't want another her. I nodded. I propose dissolving Bridger Heights HOA effective immediately. Instead we form Bridger Neighbors. No fines, no dumb rules, just helping each other. The diner girl stood. I'm in. I want to grow veggies out front without lawsuits. The old lady grinned. I want Christmas lights up year-round. Laughter rippled, then the room voted. 70 hands up, no dissent. The old HOA died amid thunderous applause. I held up the compensation papers. The court gave me $500,000 for the fire and land grab. I'm not keeping it solo, This rebuilds my house into a shared space for the neighborhood. A community garden, a meeting spot, whatever we need." The crowd roared louder, some shouting, "Henry!" Tom zoomed in, grinning. "Bozeman's gonna love this," he muttered. I looked at the old lady. "What do you think?" She nodded, eyes gleaming. "I want a corner for flowers. My husband loved them." The next week, neighbors got to work. I hired a local crew with part of the money, rebuilding my house into an open home, wide porch with vines, big kitchen and a sprawling yard where the bean garden once stood. The old man brought a shovel, the diner girl hauled water, and the old lady directed planting the first flower bushes. Tom posted daily videos. Day 1, Bridger Heights reborn. Views soaring, hundreds of comments praising us. One afternoon the diner girl pulled me to the yard. "Look, Henry, I saw over 20 new veggie rows, beans, tomatoes, squash, planted by neighbors. Now everyone wants a garden," she laughed. I used the remaining money to set up the Sullivan Land Trust, safeguarding Bridger Heights land from any future Victor Graysons. Mark, my lawyer, drafted the legal papers, ensuring my family's mineral rights and easements stayed secure forever. "You've changed, Bozeman," he said over the phone. "Montana's learning from you." I chuckled, gazing at the thriving community garden under Gallatin sunlight. "I just wanted to grow beans, Mark. Everyone else did the rest." One evening, I sat on the new porch, watching neighbors gather, some grilling, others playing ball with kids. The old lady approached, holding a stack of old papers. "These are my husband's last HOA reports," she said. "No use now, but I want you to keep them as a memento." I took them, thanking her. "He'd be proud," I said. She nodded, eyes glistening. "He'd love this garden." I looked around. Bridger Heights wasn't a place of rules and fines anymore. It was home, a community we rebuilt from ashes. She and Victor lost, but we won bigger, not just land, but trust in each other. I stood in the new community garden, Bozeman's late fall sun filtering through the Gallatin Range, gilding the rows of beans, tomatoes, and squash stretching before the finished house. 2 months since the Montana State Court win, Bridger Heights had transformed. The Sullivan ancestral home was now the neighborhood hub, sprawling porch draped in vines, open kitchen fragrant with baked goods, and a lush front yard of veggies grown together. Today was Bridger neighbors' first harvest festival, and the area buzzed like never before. The old lady approached, cane tapping slowly, holding a plump green bean. "Henry, this is the first from my row," she said, grinning toothlessly. "My husband would have loved this garden." I took it, the bean's cool touch recalling days I just wanted to plant in peace. "Thanks. It's not just my garden anymore, it's ours." She nodded, eyes shining, then pointed to the yard. "Look, bigger crowd than I expected." Over 100 people gathered around the garden, the gray-haired man grilling meat on a makeshift barbecue, the diner girl setting up a table of fresh veggies, kids running around with small decorated pumpkins. Tom paced back and forth, camera in hand, capturing every moment. "This video's gonna blow up YouTube, Henry," he shouted from afar. "All of Bozeman's watching us." I smiled, looking at the radiant faces, no more shadows of fines or ridiculous rules. Bridger Heights was now a place where people could be themselves. I stepped onto a makeshift wooden platform, holding the old community center mic. "Everyone, listen up for a sec." The chatter quieted, neighbors turning to face me. 2 months ago, I just wanted to grow beans without hassle. But she and Victor Grayson brought bulldozers, trashed my garden, burned my house, tried to steal the land beneath us. I held up the 1974 contract, now carefully laminated. We stood up, not just for land, but for each other. Today, this garden, this house, is proof we're stronger than they thought. The crowd clapped, some cheered, the old man raising a beer can, yelling Henry. The diner girl stepped forward, placing a basket of tomatoes on the platform. "You changed everything, Henry. Now I grow veggies out front without fear of fines." The old lady chimed in. "And I've got Christmas lights up early. No one dares say a word." Laughter rang out, and I nodded. That's what I wanted. A Bridger Heights where everyone's free to be themselves. The compensation rebuilt this place, and the Sullivan Land Trust will protect our land forever. Victor can hide, but he's not coming back. Tom approached, shoving the camera in my face. Say something to the audience, Henry. I looked straight into the lens, taking a deep breath. I'm Henry Sullivan from Bozeman, Montana. I just wanted to plant veggies, but ended up fighting people trying to steal my land and my neighbors. We won because we stood together. If someone tries to take what's yours, land, home, or freedom, don't give up. Find the truth, find friends, and fight. Bozeman did it, and you can too. Like and subscribe if you're with us. Tom laughed loud. Perfect. This'll hit 1 million views. I stepped down, sitting beside the old lady on a freshly built bench. She handed me a slice of pie from the kitchen. You remind me of my husband, she said. Stubborn, but always for what's right. I took a bite, gazing at the vibrant garden under the Gallatin sunset. I didn't want to own Montana. I just wanted peace. But sometimes, peace has to be fought for. Night fell, string lights twinkling on the porch, music drifting from a small speaker. Neighbors danced, kids ran with pumpkins. I closed my eyes, feeling the cool Montana breeze, thinking of Dad and Grandpa, who'd held this land for me. She and Victor lost, but we won bigger. A community stronger than ever. I opened my eyes, smiling. A journey that started with a few beans ended with all of Bozeman in my heart. Henry Sullivan's story in Bozeman, Montana, mirrors very real issues in modern American society, from the overreach of organizations like HOAs, to the greed of real estate developers, and the power of community when united. In the tale, Maggie Pierce and Victor Grayson represent those who abuse authority for profit, like when they embezzled HOA funds and plotted to mine limestone under Henry's land, even burning his house to silence him. This isn't fiction. In the U.S. today, many HOAs face criticism for imposing absurd rules, fining residents over trivialities like house paint or flower pots, while some developers manipulate zoning to snatch land on the cheap. Henry's actions, from leveraging the 1974 contract to secure his exemption to enlisting Tom to expose the truth in the press, highlight the importance of knowing your rights and using transparent information to combat injustice. Especially, the scene where Bridger Heights neighbors join him to rebuild the community garden after the fire showcases solidarity, a core American value, where community movements often triumph over oppression. The lesson here is in modern American life, don't hesitate to stand up when your rights are threatened. Dig into legal documents, like Henry did with his family's contract, and find allies, as he did with Tom and the old lady Clara. More importantly, build bonds with neighbors, because when Maggie burned Henry's house, it was the community that pulled him through. In a country that prizes individual freedom, yet brims with inequities, persistence and unity are key to protecting what's yours, from a small garden to an entire community. If you enjoyed the journey from a trashed garden to Bridger Heights victory, hit subscribe so you don't miss more stories of fighting for truth. Thanks for joining me in Bozeman. See you in the next video with more surprises.